Good Friday morning. Today is December 14th, 2012, and I am student meteorologist Ryan Belz, here with your KBIS special report on the Fall 2012 Meteorology 201 Semester Group Project. Reporting to you live here from the Bismarck, North Dakota Airport. Alongside me today are my co-hosts out in the field. First off, we have Ms. Taylor Block, Mr. Samuel Collins, and Mr. Robert Mayo. Along with my three co-hosts out in the field, we have four other important factors that are going to be playing a role in today's presentation. Let's introduce them now.
It's a battle of forecasting between providers and climatology. In the first corner, all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, give it up for the Weather Channel.
The Weather Channel's the best. You want to know why? Because we name our winter storms. For example, Rocky.
The battle of the forecasting providers and climatology continues, and in the second corner, all the way from San Francisco, California, give it up for Weather Underground.
I'm the Underground, and we will overthrow the enemy forecasters.
The forecasting battle continues between the providers and climatology, and in the third corner, from State College, Pennsylvania, give it up for AccuWeather.
Oh yeah? We're so good we provide a 25-day forecast for our viewers. You can join the trend and follow us via Twitter by searching @AccuWeather.
Rounding out the battle of the forecasting providers and climatology, in the fourth and final corner, all the way from right here in Bismarck, North Dakota, give it up for the National Weather Service's Climatology.
Oh yeah, records can't lie, and neither can we. Trusting us is easy to do. We're not just the average Joe, we're simply the historical average.
And the question remains, who will win?
The climate overview for Bismarck, North Dakota is humid continental, based on its mid-level latitude orientation and low precipitation records. It has well-defined seasons, and on average, the warmest month is in July, with an average temperature of 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The record high was found in 1936 and was 114 degrees Fahrenheit. On average, the coldest month is January with an average temperature of 23 degrees Fahrenheit. The record low is negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and this was found in 1916 and 1936. The average annual precipitation is about 17 inches, and the average winter snowfall is about 49 inches. Some of the records that stand out for each month: in January, the average high was 23 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average low was 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The mean was 13 degrees Fahrenheit, and the record low was negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit in 1916. For February, the record low was negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit in 1936. In June, the average precipitation was a little over 3 inches. In July, the average high was 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the average low was 57 degrees Fahrenheit, and the mean was 71 degrees Fahrenheit. The record high in July was 114 degrees Fahrenheit in 1936.
The forecasting providers in climatology showed some trends in their errors as the seasons change. For instance, within the first few days of the forecast, the error is much lower than the later days in the forecast. Additionally, it seems that the error is lower in the earlier months of the project, September, late summer, early autumn. than in the later ones, November, December, also known as late autumn. The dates that were missed were not counted in the area.
In general, within the first 3 days, the forecasted highs were on average between negative 0.3 and 0.6 degrees off the observed. When we look out to the 7-day forecast, you can see that the forecasted highs were on average between negative 1 and 0.6 degrees off the observed. Looking out to the 10-day forecast overall, you can see that the average range was between negative 1 and 1.3 degrees off the observed. The absolute error for the first 3 days was on average 4 degrees off of the observed. Out to the 7 days, we can see that it was off between 4 and 7 degrees. Out to 10 days, we can see that they were off 4 to 10 degrees from the observed.
In general, within the first 3 days, the forecasted highs are on average between 0.05 and 0.8 degrees off the observed. When looking out to 7 days, the forecasted highs are on average between negative 1 and 0.8 degrees off the observed. Looking at the 10-day forecast overall, the average range was between negative 3 and 0.8 degrees.
In general, within the first 3 days, the mean errors for the forecasted highs were between negative 0.3 and 0.7 degrees off of the observed. When looking out to their 7-day forecast, their mean error in the forecasted highs were on average between negative 1 and 0.7 degrees off of the observed. Looking out at the 15-day forecast overall, the mean errors for the forecasted highs were between negative 1 and 1.3 degrees off of the observed. In general, within the first 3 days, the absolute mean errors for the forecasted highs were 4 degrees off of the observed. When looking out to their 7-day forecast, their absolute mean error in forecaster highs were on average between negative 4 and 7 degrees off of the observed. Looking out at the 15-day forecast, overall, the absolute mean errors for the forecasted highs were between negative 4 and 12 degrees off of the observed.
In general, within the first 3 days, the forecasted highs were on average between 0.1 and 0.4 degrees off of the observed. When looking out at the 7 days, the forecasted highs were on average also between 0.1 and 0.8 degrees off the observed. Looking out of the 15-day forecast overall, the average range was also between 0.1 and 0.8 degrees. The absolute error for the first 3 days was on average between 9.7 and 10 degrees. Out to 7 and 15, it was between 9.7 and 10 degrees.
Yes, there were forecast days beyond that the forecast from the providers was no better than Climatology. AccuWeather's forecast days of 12 to 15 were on average no better than Climatology. For the forecast days 12 to 15, AccuWeather was off on average 11 and 12 degrees. Climatology, on the other hand, for the forecast days 12 to 15, was only off 10 degrees.
Looking at the frequency distribution table for the Weather Channel's Day 7 forecast, we can observe from the first column, column X, the number of degrees that they were off from the observed temperatures. They were off anywhere from 0 to 22 degrees, with the most being 2 and 3 degrees off. They were off by 2 degrees 8 times, and they were off by 3 degrees 9 times. Looking at the last column, the cumulative percentage, we can see that 80% of the time they were no more than 10 degrees off of the observed temperatures.
The first column is the degrees that Weather Underground was off in their forecasts. The second column is the number of times they were off by each degree. They were off the most by 1, 6, and 11 degrees, with 9 times for each one. They were off the least amount of times by 16, 17, and 19 degrees, with once for each degree. They were never off by 9 or 17 degrees. The last column is a percentage that they were off by that degree and less. For example, they were off by 11 degrees and less 76% of the time.
Looking at the frequency distribution for Day 7 from AccuWeather, we can observe from the first column the degrees that AccuWeather was off in their forecasts. The second column is the number of times they were off by each degree. AccuWeather was off the most by 3 degrees, with that happening 12 times. Also, AccuWeather was off 2 and 4 degrees 8 times each. They were off the least amount of times by 15, 18, and 21 degrees, with once for each one. They were never off by 10, 13, 17, and 20 degrees. The last column is the percentage that they were off by that degree and less. For example, 74.67% of the time, they were off by no more than 9 degrees.
Looking at the frequency distribution from day 7 for climatology, we can observe from the last column the degrees that climatology is off in their forecasts. The second column is the number of times they are off by each degree. Climatology is off by 1 and 11 degrees, with 7 times for each one. They are off the least amount of times by 0, 5, 7, 19, 20, 22, 23, and 25 degrees, with 1s for each one. They were never off by 24 degrees. The last column is the percentage that they are off by that degree and less. For example, 51.85% of the time they are off by no more than 10 degrees.
In general, within the first 3 days, the forecasted highs were between 6.1 and 7.8 standard deviations off the mean. When we look out to the 7-day forecasted highs, they were between 4.7 and 9 standard deviations off the mean error. And then when we look out to the whole 10-day forecasted highs, we can see that the standard deviation was between 4.7 and 12 degrees off the mean error. Within the first 3 days, as we look at the absolute mean error, we can see that the standard deviations were between 5 and 7 standard deviations away from the mean error. Looking at the 7-day forecasted highs, we can see that the standard deviation was between 3 and 7 standard deviations off of the mean error. And out to 15 days, that was the same.
In general, in the first 3 days, the forecasted highs were between 6.4 and 8.4 standard deviations from the mean error. When looking out to 7 days, the forecasted highs were between 5.7 to 9.9 standard deviations from the mean error. Looking at the 10-day forecast, overall the standard deviation ranged from 5.7 to 12 degrees from the mean error. Within the first 3 days, the forecasted highs were 5 to 7 standard deviations from the mean error. When looking out to the 7 days, the forecasted highs were 4 to 7 standard deviations from the absolute mean error. And at 10 days was the same.
Looking at the 15-day forecast, overall the standard deviations ranged from 5.7 to 15 degrees from the mean error. Within the first 3 days, the forecasted highs were 5 to 7 standard deviations from the mean error. When looking at the 7 days, the forecasted highs were 4 to 7 standard deviations from the absolute mean error, and up to 15 days, they were 4 to 9 standard deviations from the absolute mean error.
The mean standard deviation forecast is 12 every day, and the absolute mean standard deviation error is 6.5 the first day and 6 every other day.
To compare the consistency among the providers, we graphed a chart of the average mean errors for each. As you can see, none of the providers were all that consistent in their forecasts. AccuWeather was either too warm or too cool in their forecast. The Weather Channel for the first part of their forecast period was too cold, and then on the second half of their forecast period they were too warm. Weather Underground became quite cool in their forecasts toward the end of their forecasting period. Additionally, on this chart we graphed climatology. With the climatology line, you can observe that they were too warm, but consistently too warm during their forecast period.
What are some of the limitations in terms of evaluating our providers? Well, one of them is the fact that we miss 7 days in collecting our data. The other one is the fact that AccuWeather has a 15-day forecast versus the traditional 10-day forecast used by Weather Channel and Weather Underground. Another limitation is the fact that computer models have a limited number of calculations that they can use to forecast the highs of temperatures in the future. Another one is the fact that the weather is always changing, so a forecast at one point changes the minute that they forecast it. Finally, it's to the degree that a meteorologist can analyze the data given to him by a computer model.
On average, the Weather Channel of all of our providers was most accurate. The Weather Channel was on average only 5.8 degrees off of the observed. Each of our providers that we used in this project had a cold bias. On average, the Weather Channel's cold bias was negative 0.7 degrees cooler than the observed. For AccuWeather, they were negative 0.3 degrees cooler than the observed temperatures. And for Weather Underground, they were negative 1.2 degrees cooler than the observed temperatures in Bismarck, North Dakota. Climatology, on the other hand, had a warm bias of 0.5 degrees. This represents that on average, temperatures in Bismarck, North Dakota are warmer because the climatology is the average of what has happened in the past.
And as we sign off here on this wonderful Friday morning, we're going to take a look at our live webcam of downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. For myself, student meteorologist Ryan Belz, Taylor Block, Samuel Collins, and Robert Mayo, we'd like to thank you for tuning in, and have a great afternoon.